Today's video will be removing the injection pump from this M1097A2 Humvee and figuring out why it doesn't work. So we're going to go from this to that. One of the common things that can happen on a 6.5 is that the valley will fill with water. And there is a drain located inside the valley. And it goes to a tube that's inside basically the back of the bell housing of the transmission, covers it up. And the opening for it is down there. It's actually this tube right down here. I'm touching with my finger, kind of next to the oil filter and all the oil cooler lines. So what I'm going to do is take a air nozzle and slide it in there, and then I can get the air nozzle in the opening. It'll blow all the debris out, and then water should be able to drain back out. The problem comes in that rocks and dirt and mud and rust from the block all accumulate and plug the line. The line itself is probably about 3/8, but the problem comes in that for extra clearance, they smashed part of the line flat so that it clears the flex plate. Well, that's where it picks up all the dirt and rocks and doesn't let them pass through. And once that happens, the valley always fills with water, or if you have a fuel leak, it'll fill with diesel fuel. And well, it'll rust out the valley, and then it'll submerge parts of the injection pump that really aren't meant to be wet all the time. And it can cause the injection pump to basically stop working, which is, I think, what deadlined this thing. We're going to take a look at the throttle cable and the injection pump next. The throttle pedal doesn't really want to move to the floor. It's kind of stuck. I made sure the throttle lock's not engaged, but still not getting any movement. That I can barely actuate the thing by hand. There's a little clip on the end of the linkage, and I'm going to try to get that off so I can see if it's the cable that's hung up or if it's the injection pump itself. There really wasn't a great spot to put the camera, so I missed it on video, but I removed the clip from the end of the pump arm, and now I've got the cable free. I can easily grab the cable and move it. So that tells me that the cable's free, the throttle lock's not engaged, and it's something with the injection pump. I'm going to take the air intake off, starting with the flexible tube. Next will be the actual air intake to the intake manifold. It's a 1/2 inch socket. On extension you can get in past all the heater control wires, and a lot more thread engagement in this bolt than I would have thought it would be. Alright, don't want to lose the washer. The next few hours were spent trying to disassemble and diagnose the injection pump without removing the intake manifold. From how slow that went, it was clear that it probably wasn't ever designed to be done that way. After removing the throttle position sensor and finally the advance arm from the injection pump, it was clear that the advance plunger was corroded in place, and that was the reason that the throttle wouldn't move. So the injection pump would have to be removed from the engine, and I'd need to take the intake manifold off anyway to do that. I'm going to start taking this wiring harness off so I can get the intake out. So there's a couple grounds on the back. Fairly straightforward to take off. That way when I go to pull the intake, I won't be stuck with these wires being in the way or things like that. So I'll just put the bolt back just so I don't lose it. I know where things go. Then these little connectors, I've had these apart before, but I'll put some dielectric grease on and make them separate easier. Now my luck is the dirt's all going to get in there and it's going to be a mess, but we'll cross that bridge, I suppose. The battery is disconnected. I wouldn't be taking connectors apart if it wasn't. That's a surefire way to mess things up or blow up the transmission controller, or God only knows what, or the smart box. All right, on the other head, you can see over there the grounding cable I made. So I'll take that off so it's out of the way. The early trucks had some issues with grounding, so I made a cable to connect directly to the start box mount, as well as the stud that is the mount for, or that's the ground for all the stuff under the dash, or the instrument panel, I suppose. Can't really call this little tiny thing a dashboard, but yeah, that'll help it get accurate gauge readings, things like that. Pulling more bolts from the intake manifold. As I pull them out, this is number 7 cylinder, and just put them in a bag just to make sure I don't lose which ones are which. So I'm just using a little socket to undo this worm clamp. It's kind of funny that that's working. I'm trying to not drop the socket into the engine valley. That's the line that runs to the fuel filter. I'll probably get some diesel out of this when it comes off. Yep, I do have new rubber lines to use to replace these with, rather than putting 20-year-old lines back on there. Buried under here is the fuel filter. The hose clamps are this goofy 7mm. I've never really seen 7mm before. I'm not sure where they found those, but this truck is full of surprises. And I made the mistake of opening the garage door, and now I have all those little brown beetles that just crash into the ceiling and the ground and seemingly fly but don't know how, which is quite surprising. Try to cheat a little bit and use the nut driver from the back, which I can't reach this from that side. I can from here. I should ever put this hose clamp on. I would have pointed it in that direction. The next hose to remove from the fuel filter is the one for the water drain. It's down here at the bottom. Again, it's another 7mm. Yeah, it's covered in dirt. Everything's super sharp too. I mean, I get needing to put a fuel filter in, but it's one of the weirdest places you could put it. It's not very accessible. Removing the fuel filter housing, it's held with a little clamp here. It takes a 7/16. I think this clamshell just kind of opens up and I can pull the filter housing forward. At least that's my hope. Looks to be the case. Alright, here we go. Dump fuel all over myself. So this is what the fuel filter housing looks like removed. There's the kind of drain down there, the inlet, and then the inlet actually has a check valve on it, and then that's the outlet. Making sure to have the drain pan underneath. Now I'm going to take the lines off for the hydro boost and all the lines for the power steering reservoir, so that I can get it out of the way. Next one's up here. Since these are just standard hoses, I'm just going to slit the hose. I'm going to be able to get the thing off. If these were more specialized, I'd probably be trying a little harder at this, but there's no sense in keeping literally 20-year-old hoses. The next one's going to be the connection to the feed, or I guess you could say the supply line to the pump. So one of the other interesting aspects about this whole system is, in looking up the part numbers, there's in the technical manual, or parts manual, the whole system, the filter inside there, everything else, is a Cummins part. So it'll be interesting to see how that all works. If I can get the filter or something else from other than like AM General. So although AM General might be the cheapest, I've noticed that recently too, that while other places may have the filter, that AM General puts a lot of these together and they probably get a decent deal on filters. The reservoir is held on by basically two nuts that are on these studs. The nuts are 15 millimeter, so I've already got one out. Then should be able to get the other. All right, next is to weasel the reservoir out. Again, have the drain pan ready because it's going to leak. Oh, that's crusty and gross. All right, let's figure out what to do with these. If I'm keeping them or replacing them. Truth be told, some of it smells like dirty fish in there. Yeah, that's pretty gross. So these are the last two on the driver's side. The studs that are on cylinder 7. That one's loose. And then the stud that's on cylinder 5. Many times the video will cut away and then all of a sudden the bolt will be out. Everyone knows how to loosen a bolt, so I'll skip over the boring parts. So one more thing that has to come off is this switch. This switch is the switch that deactivates the fan clutch. So when you floor it, this switch, basically there's a rod and that gets pulled, and then that switch makes contact and it tells the time delay module to deactivate the cooling fan for water fording and other stuff. So to get that free of the injection pump, I'm going to loosen this whole bracket and then slide it forward, and then I can remove it from the linkage on the injection pump. All right, so now we can slide this whole thing out. And yeah, it's just this cheesy little micro switch with this linkage on it. Next thing that has to come loose is the bracket for the CDR valve. So I already loosened these up, so I should be able to just kind of wiggle them out by hand. Or I'll use the socket as a nut driver. It's kind of funny with the doghouse the way it is and being able to climb in this way, it's actually almost easier to get some of these bolts from inside the truck even though they're under the hood because it's a shorter reach. For pulling the CDR valve out, there's 4 studs that hold it in place along with the hose. 2 of them are on the valve cover. You need a 13 millimeter socket for those. And then there are 2 up here, which is the same 15 millimeter socket. That's the rest of the studs and bolts. So the rear nut that holds the CDR valve, you can get through from the doghouse. It's really actually pretty easy. The bracket's loose, but I gotta get the hose out before I can actually pull the thing out. On the CDR, I can pop it loose from the valve cover studs and then try to work those up and off, and then that just pulls free. And out she comes. These will be the last 3 studs to come out. Number 4 cylinder and number 6. With everything free, I get a pry bar in here and kind of pop the manifold up. I can feel it coming loose. It's not light, that's for sure. This big aluminum casting. There we go. So the manifold came out the backside, basically into the cab area through the doghouse. So I'm going to carefully put these towels in the intake ports to try to keep dirt and everything else from dropping in there while I have the intake off. So for removing the bottom injection lines, I have a special wrench that is it's a socket with a slot cut in it to be able to slide over the line and get to the fitting. So the tough part is going to be how rusty these things are. That some of these are pretty stuck. So I have 2 left, and this bottom one seems in there pretty darn tight. So I'm actually worried about like stretching open the socket at this point. I got another line loose. Try to get the socket back on here. Weird thing about this pump is that all the fittings are actually at an angle. As you can see, that it doesn't come off straight. So it's a situation where the more extensions you put onto it to be able to get more leverage and get better reach with the ratchet, the worse it becomes in that the more severe angle it's at. We'll try this short one. Oh, that's not too bad. So now I'm at 7 out of 8 lines off. Still the one stuck is the bottom left. If push comes to shove, I suppose I could cut the line and just buy the replacement line for it, which isn't terrible, but I'd rather not if I don't have to. Here we go. All right, we're starting to get some movement. All right. I'm going to take the socket off and readjust it. So we go all the way back around manually. And put the wrench back on. The only reason I'm using this long ratchet is it just gives me enough extra leverage. Yeah, everything's getting wet with old diesel fuel, so I can't spin it by hand. All right, it's free now. That's all 8 lines free on the injection pump. And my hand smells like diesel. For this side with the pulleys in the way, we're going to try something a little unconventional. We're going to try a 1/4 inch drive. See what happens here. Not my best 1/4 inch drive ratchet, but it's the one I have. All right. To remove the oil fill tube, I'm going to have to take the belt and this pulley off. Belt's loose. Now I can take the idler pulley off. All right, I'm going to work the filler neck out. Might have to use a little pry bar in there, but that's the filler neck. And then take a rag and try to clean all the dirt and funk off of this before I accidentally ingest it in the engine. Yeah, it's just a rubber donut. So I'll get that cleaned up before I put it back in. Maybe you can get a new one. I'm going to insert this cut up paper towel roll and use it in there to catch the bolt. So I'm not going to take the bolt all the way out. I'm just going to get it loose with this first socket, but I can feel it in there. I've got the tube all the way up against the gear, and I'm going to use this longer one to kind of break it loose. Now I can switch to the socket with the magnet in it. I can use it to get the bolt the rest of the way out. The nuts that hold the injection pump to the block are 15 millimeter and they're 12 point. So I've already got the wrench on there. I'm going to cheat and put a little extension on to give yourself a little more leverage. So that's the top one. The other two, I'm not so sure that I can get from the top. Maybe I can. We'll try it. So this is actually working out with a 15 millimeter 12-point socket, a universal joint, and an extension. Here's the second nut. To get this last nut off, I've got an extension that runs all the way down the valley to a universal joint to the socket. I'm going to try to get it that way. And after breaking it loose, I can use the socket and the universal. All right, with 3 of the nuts off, I'm going to start weaseling the pump back. I'm going to have to kind of move it around some of the lines. Oh, don't go back in. Definitely smells like diesel. There we go. Corrosion on the injection pump is pretty apparent now that the pump is out of the Humvee. I haven't opened the mechanical advanced plunger housing to see if it has any damage internally. The plan is to box it up and send it out to be rebuilt. Because I might have to replace some of the injection lines, I'm actually going to remove them from the injectors themselves. So doing that, you need a 3/4 inch, basically a flare nut wrench, just so it doesn't strip them out. And then they're not actually in that tight, but it's a matter of just being able to get the leverage on them. So it's kind of a confined space, as you can imagine. So the driver's side and the front 2 cylinders on the passenger side were fairly easy. And then when you crack them loose, inevitably diesel leaks out down your finger. So getting the one off on number 8's going to be interesting. I've got to put the wrench on from the doghouse side. Now I'm going to see if I can reach it from the hood side, just so I can get a better... There we go. With it being loose, I don't need the flare nut anymore. I can just take it loose with a regular 3/4 wrench. Because of the space constraints, I just put a 7mm socket on the 1/4 inch drive ratchet versus just trying to use a nut driver. Yeah, it's just this tiny little rusty thing. Yeah, this P-clamp's got to come out. All right, there we go. There's that. All right, now come the lines. Having fought with the gasket remover and scraper for a while, I'm now going to try this. It's a 3M Scotch-Brite roll-off disc and an air drill, and we're going to just take gasket off that way. Now that I've removed the intake gasket that was stuck to the heads, I'm going to vacuum out the lifter valley and the heads themselves in preparation for just cleanup and painting the lifter valley. I do have a feeling I'll be replacing the water pump. So if that's the case, I'll be taking this timing cover off anyway, because that's how you have to get the water pump out. It's not exactly easy to fit in here. I'm tacking it from the passenger side, mostly because the engine's canted and everything. So it's actually closer to the passenger side than it is the driver's side. The last little bit of gasket I'm going to try to get with this dental pick, just to get the areas where the razor blade scraper can't reach or where I can't see from the top. So the top was pretty effective. The only thing that stinks about doing it this way is my head's actually pretty close to the LED light that I have, and it's kind of hot. So I'm sweating even though the garage is fairly cool. As I said, I'm probably going to wind up changing the water pump, which means I have to take the front of this cover off anyway. But I don't want to do that until after I have the pump back on, because I don't want the pump gear to jump a tooth or anything kind of stupid with me taking the cover off, which would be pretty terrible. So then it would involve a lot more effort to get it all back together versus just being able to swap the pump back in without having moved the timing gears or anything like that. I think that's pretty clean. Now to vacuum out the valley once again and get it ready for high temperature paint. With the engine valley now clean and dirt free and degreased, just using brake cleaner, I'm actually going to put a little bit of paint on the surfaces that are starting to be a little rusty. This is just simple Rust-Oleum high heat paint, just a quart of it from hardware store. So it's enamel. I think it'll work fine. It basically says to do one coat. Not really any rhyme or reason to how I'm doing it, just putting it in there. So the idea being that hopefully it'll keep the block from rusting and maybe aid in water drainage and just kind of overall appearance. So I'm going to be kind of careful to not flood the block and plug the hole at the back, which would defeat the entire purpose of doing this. So the other thing I'm going to avoid is getting paint on the injection pump mounting flange. That I don't want any of it there. That would possibly make the pump not be square to the gear or some other situation. I'm not painting a Ferrari, so I'm not really too concerned about runs or drips or anything, but I am trying to avoid getting it into things like the intake ports or splashing it on some of these fuel lines or other things, just to make it look nice, not have a paint dripped everywhere. And I'm literally using the cheapest brush that was available at Home Depot. It was $1.30 or something. The only reason I'm doing it now at 12:16, sorry. Figure this can dry overnight versus me watching paint dry or anything of that nature. A little bit of time and effort and some black paint, and it looks pretty good in there. So now I just got to let it dry for, well, a few days. I mean, until I get the injection pump back. I'm not doing anything in there.